Hi, I'm Caitlin Dubin, and this is the Rural Woman Podcast. I'm a first-generation farmer who married into agriculture. Born and raised in a city, I was so unfamiliar with where my food came from, but I was determined to figure it out. Through my journey into agriculture, I saw women who were strong but humble, often taking a back seat. To me, these women were leaders who deserved a seat at the table. I created the Rural Woman Podcast to share the voices of women in an industry whose stories often went untold. The rural entrepreneurs who live and breathe their work, full of grit and pride. We come here to share our stories, to be in community with each other, to be challenged and inspired, but most importantly, to be celebrated and to be heard. We may not all live, farm, ranch, or homestead the same, but we are all connected. We are rural women, and our stories are worthy of being told. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Rural Woman Podcast. Today you'll meet Alyssa Allen. Alyssa is first and foremost an animal lover. That passion has brought her to many adventures, most current being the herd manager at the Musk Ox Farm in Palmer, Alaska. Being a lifelong Alaskan, she knows well the struggles of farm work in the unforgiving Arctic. It is tough work for regular farm animals, let alone the least researched North American ice-aged mammal. My friends, I hope you can hear it in my voice how excited I am for you to meet Alyssa Allen. We get into the story of how I found out about the Musk Ox Farm in Palmer, Alaska, in her interview. It was a pleasure to learn more about this creature of a muskox, and I am so excited for you to learn along with me all about this really neat animal and all of the amazing work that Alyssa and the team at the Musk Ox Farm are doing to preserve these incredible, neat animals. And I also have a special video for our patrons over on Patreon that I'm going to be sharing of my own muskox sighting, not quite in the wild. So I'm going to be sharing that over on Patreon just as a little bonus. So if you want to see that video as well as all of the extended audio that we have from previous guests, as well as my solo podcast, maybe you can relate. You can head to the link in the show notes and learn more about how you can support the Rural Woman Podcast through Patreon and get special behind the scenes footage and a muskox video shot by yours truly. Without further ado, my friends, let's get to this week's episode with Alyssa. Alyssa, welcome to the Rural Woman Podcast. How are you today?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing so good. Alyssa, I am very excited to chat with you today. And if I can be a dork and just repeat myself of everything I said when we hopped on this call so people can hear how excited I am to talk to you. I had Alyssa and the organization that Alyssa works for on my list of people I wanted to talk to, of rural women I wanted to talk to in this industry, because you have such an interesting job and you live in such an interesting place and you take care of such interesting animals. So I'm very excited to chat with you.
I am too.
Not to embarrass you before we start or anything. But thank you for saying yes to a complete stranger who reached out and said, "Hey, will you talk on my podcast?"
Yeah, it's first for me. So yeah. I'm here for it though.
Good. I'm so happy. So before I keep fangirling too much, Alyssa, for the listeners who are unfamiliar with you, tell us who you are, where you're from, and how you got your start in agriculture.
Sure. I am Alyssa. I live in Wasilla, Alaska. I work in Palmer, so they're kind of sister cities right next to each other. So the farm is in Palmer, Alaska, and then Wasilla is just right next door. I grew up here in Wasilla. I left the state for a couple years to go to college in Colorado and got some good experience working with large animals in zoos, and then came right back because this is where I love to be. My whole family lives here. So I really started my career in working towards zookeeping. I really just wanted to work with animals, and it's the young person's dream to work with all of the big cool animals. And I just kind of quickly saw that muskox are really cool. So I fell in love with muskox at the Alaska Zoo. I worked there for 4 years, and I ended up just being wholly obsessed with the muskox. I was working with polar bears and brown bears and black bears and tigers and all of these amazing, cool species that on the outside, a lot of people would be more excited about, the big carnivores. But I really fell in love with the muskox, and I got to a place, the Alaska Zoo is in Anchorage, and I was living in Wasilla, and I had bought a wonderful little homestead of my own with my husband, and we have chickens and turkeys, and kind of starting to not want to drive to Anchorage all the time every day. And so I was just kind of looking for other opportunities. Growing up in Wasilla, I had always been around the Musk Ox Farm. There's a picture of me in first grade here at the Musk Ox Farm along the same pastures that I work now with my whole class. And so I kind of heard about this position, and thought that there was no way that I was qualified or of interest. And I ended up getting the position. And so here we are, where I only started last April. And so I am pretty fresh, but it's kind of a trial by fire situation. There's not a lot of people that run a Musk Ox farm. So it's really any problems that you have, you troubleshoot yourself. And they are the least researched North American animal. And so we are really out here just figuring it out every day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And I can just hear the voices of the listeners that I know they're so excited to learn everything there is about a muskox. And if they're not, well, buckle up, because we're going to learn everything about a muskox. And I already warned Alyssa, I'm going to ask the silly questions because I myself don't know a lot about muskox, and I can guess that there's a lot of people listening that don't know about them either. So we're going to dive into all of the nerdy things about muskox, but I want to learn more about your position as the herd manager at this farm. And I love that this was a place growing up that you loved going and just participating and seeing these incredible animals. So what is your first memory of this muskox farm?
Well, honestly, it would probably have to be when I was in first grade. We would take class field trips out to the Muskox farm. And, it's always just kind of been here. Like all growing up, it was just, oh yes, there's a neighborhood, and then there's the Muskox farm where there's 80 muskox just casually in the middle of Palmer.
Yeah, that's good. Tell us more about Palmer, Alaska, and where you're from. There's always the misconceptions of people living in Alaska. Honestly, there's misconceptions of people living in Canada that we live in igloos with polar bears, but honestly, that would probably be more of a reality for you versus me.
Right. Yes. So we're pretty southern in Wasilla and Palmer. We're pretty southern Alaska. Anchorage is the big city, and that's about an hour away. And so in Palmer, Wasilla, it is a very small town, but we do have a Target, and we do have some grocery stores. So we're not living in igloos, but it's certainly, we don't have the specialty stores that big cities would have. But basically anything that you could need is found in Anchorage, which is not that far away. So Palmer is very much the agriculture city of Alaska. Alaska as a whole is not a big agriculture state just because of how difficult it is to have things like hay and feed, and the snow is a big problem. Everything's just harder up here. And so there is a small space of agriculture out here in Palmer. And then Wasilla is more of the suburban town. They're right close to each other. And the small bit of agriculture that we have up here is mostly in Palmer.
So you had mentioned that you went to the southern states to go to school. but you quickly went home. And I always am curious, for folks who are living in these northern climates, is that typical, or were most of the people that, you went to school with, they were like, I'm getting the heck out of here?
Yeah, I think it's probably a solid 50-50. Either you want to be here forever or you don't. And I certainly have my days that I think to myself, why on earth do we live here? Because everything is just a little bit harder here. But yeah, I mean, the family part is a big part. I have a huge family up here. So that's really hard to stay away from. I just knew for certain that I had to come back.
Right. Well, I knew for certain that you wanted to work with big, fun animals.
Yes.
And when I think of a big, fun animal, I'm going to think of a muskox from now on because they're real cool.
They're so cool. Yeah.
And I'm trying to remember. So I was explaining to Alyssa about my fascination with muskox and how I've been following your farm on Instagram forever because these muskox are so cool. And I remember looking into, I'm like, who can I talk to from this farm? Because if the name doesn't really explain it to you, I talked to women in agriculture. And then when I saw that a woman was the herd manager of a muskox farm, all my dreams came true. So how about you tell us about your farm and where you're working? Give us the history. When did it start? All of the stuff.
So the Musk Ox Farm has kind of a twisty history. John Teal was a man that just had a serious love for muskox, and he was certain that we needed muskox everywhere. Honestly, I have been working here for, over a year, but I don't have the whole history memorized in my head. Basically, John Teal, he wanted to domesticate the muskox essentially to give as a gift to Native Alaskans as an agricultural product that we could set up muskox farms to be income for Native Alaskans. So that was kind of his fever dream back in the 80s. And so he acquired muskox. We understand that it takes hundreds of thousands of years to domesticate an animal. So we would call our animals habituated. They are born on property and trained and handled in a way that we know is sustainable for their entire lifetime so that we can use them for education to the public and sustainable kivute production. And so kivute is the underhair of the muskox. That is the interesting thing about them. There are lots of interesting things about them, but a lot of people are very interested in their hair. And so they have a double coat. The guard hair stays on them, and I hand comb the underhair out, and it's a very soft and fine fiber. And so that's where we get, the fiber artists that really want to work with the hair. And it's a very specialty thing. Either you get it from us or you're getting it from people that pick it up off of the ground in the area that the wild muskox exist, or you're getting it from hunted animals that you comb it off of their hide after they've been hunted. So it's a very rare fiber because the sourcing is very difficult. But the muskox today exists as a nonprofit for education to the public about the species, about muskox, sustainable kivute production, and we try to be available for species research when we can. And so we are involved in a couple of projects that are contributing to the species as a whole. So that's kind of where we are at in 2024. How we got there, it started as this little farm, John Teal's grand idea. I think it actually started in Vermont, and then they were moved up to Alaska, and we kind of trickled into a couple different places and then settled here in, I want to say, 86. And we've been here ever since.
So cool. Now I'm going to ask you all of the nerdy things about muskox because, like I said, I don't know a lot about them besides, so to me, they look like a cross between a bison and a cow. Is that fair to say?
No.
Okay.
So they would actually be most closely related to goats.
Get out of here.
Yeah. So they're a huge Arctic goat is the basic.
I feel like I now know why I love muskox, because I'm a goat lady. I have goats right out my window. So
Yes. Yeah. So they
very cool.
taxonomy wise, yeah, they're closer to goats than cattle and bison for sure. We get the bison thing a lot, but they are not closely related to bison. So the closest North American species would be the Rocky Mountain goat. And then the closest overall species is a species of goat that lives over in the mountains, all the way in the other side of the world.
Siberia?
Yeah, that type of
Is
area.
Okay.
I would have to look it up. It's because it also changes. There's like serious debate. I swear it changes every couple of years. But it's the Goral, which is in. See, but they like to say it's the Takin also.
And this is a species of goat?
Yes.
Okay.
I believe at the moment, the Goral is considered the closest related species, and it is a goat that lives in the Himalayas.
Very cool. Okay. So talk to us about, you've been at this job now for a year and a half now. Talk to us about like when you first started and started working with these animals. What was that like?
Yeah. So a big part of the Musk Ox Farm is that we are not only sustainable, but also gentle, sustainable kid ute production is kind of our MO. And so we have these muskox that are, like I said, habituated, not domesticated. And so they are trained to interact with us the way that we would prefer them to interact with us. But at the end of the day, my biggest measure on health is weekly weights. And the way that I do that is I herd them on foot to the barn to get weighed every week. And so they are, like we said, they're related to goats, but my biggest has topped over 1,000 pounds. Average is like 500 to 600 pounds, but that's, it's still a big animal. And so I do play seating arrangements. I have 75 acres and about 30 pastures. And so I'm able to split them up into smaller groups. And so my biggest group is about 12. But what that looks like is I go out with one or two other people and I herd them on foot to the barn. It's a normal part of their day. Usually we get them in the barn first time when they're about a week old, and then every week for their whole life. And so it's a very routine thing for them, but they are still muskox and they are still stubborn and they are still free-willed, free choice animals. And we're not going out there with cattle prods. We have ourselves and that's it. And so coming from a background of zookeeping, I worked with muskox on a protected contact situation. So that means you're never stepping on the other side of the fence with them. It was pretty wild to just kind of get thrown into this situation where you're just like, oh, you just trust, they are used to it. They know what they're doing. But then, they all have very individual personalities. And so some of them will, bluff charge or do muskox things, normal muskox behavior. And we just accept it. We're not aiming to be rough with them ever. And so it was pretty intimidating at first, but then you just kind of get in the swing of it and they know their job and you know your job and you herd them like you would anything else.
Like a normal goat.
Like a normal goat. Yeah.
Who is many hundreds of pounds less than that muskox.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So, and like you said, they all I'm sure they all have their type of personalities and temperament. And the more that you work with them, you're going to learn that that's one that you don't mess around with. And then the other one, maybe a little bit nicer of a muskox.
The biggest thing is that they are a fiercely herd-minded creature. And so amongst their own group, they have their own hierarchy. And so the biggest thing, they're in no situation other than bulls and rut have I ever had one that's just like out to get me, but it's more like you're working with, that muskox is running towards me because the, top in this group is up there being a jerk. And so you're kind of juggling a herd of animals that has its own hierarchy amongst themselves. And accepting that their behavior is based off of everybody else's behavior. And if everybody starts running the wrong direction, then there's not a lot you can do about that because it's already started. It's very much like a snowball situation. If everybody decides today is going to be a good day and it's going to be easy, then it goes super easy. But sometimes it doesn't.
Sometimes they wake up and choose violence
They really do. They really do. Yeah.
So what does a typical day look like for you then as the herd manager?
Everything's very seasonal. So right now we're getting into winter. I'm not doing much pasture rotation anymore because everybody's in their set winter pens. They have hay feeders. They have heated water tanks. The day in the life is first get everybody in the barn, get everybody weighed. I would say cumulatively it takes around 4 to 6 hours to get all of the muskox weighed, but that's usually spread out throughout the week. And so in the morning you come in, you have to wait till it's daylight because now we're in winter and the sun doesn't come out till 8:30 or 9 right now, and herd whatever groups left I have to weigh, and then go around and feed everybody, make sure that everybody has water. And then right now I have 4 calves that were born last spring. And so a lot of my day is spent socializing with them and making sure that they have a good foundation in their routine of, if they grow up knowing that herding and weighing and all of that is just a normal thing, that then it's just much easier for their entire life. So a lot of my day is spent socializing with them, and then everything is just a project. There is so many miles of fencing on this property, and I think I could spend every day, all day, fixing fence, and I would still be fixing fence at the end of the day. So
I'm curious when you're talking about fencing. So on a typical little goat, fencing is basically like a challenge for them of how can I get out of this fencing? Is that similar to a muskox?
I would say, we have pretty big pastures. And so generally they are pretty content as long as there's not, like I said before, I play seating charts. I put animals together so that hopefully they get along so that there's not much strife amongst their little herd. Usually they don't have much pushing them to want to get out the fencing, but their long hair makes them itchy and they're growing hair all the time. And so they're just like, if they're not playing with fence that in turn breaks it, then they're rubbing on it and that breaks it. We use posts and then just wire fencing that we stretch so it's tight at the beginning at least. And then they run into it or hit it or rub on it to itch, and everything that they do just breaks it.
Yep. I know the feeling.
It's a constant problem.
Yeah. I've always said if you want good goats, then you have to have good fence, because if you don't have a good fence, you don't have a good goat. So you also need good fence for a muskox.
Yes.
So.
Yeah. Usually if it's like nice and new, they don't generally mess with it. But as soon as it starts making noise, it's fun. And then They play with it. And then
Love that. Love that for them, not for you.
Right.
So you had mentioned, obviously, you're going into the winter season. So they're in their winter pens. They're being fed hay. How long do they typically stay out on pasture for?
I mean, they're out on pasture all the time, 24/7. In the summer, I have like 2 or 3 times the amount of pastures that I would need for my groups. And so I'm able to do a really nice rotation to make sure grass is getting eaten down evenly. In the winter, everybody just stays in one pen and I bring them hay out to them. They like the cold. They would like nothing more than it to be snowing and windy and all of the things that we hate, but they are perfectly happy out there.
Yeah. Well, it's that double coat, right? It's keeping them warm. I have a Bernese mountain dog who would also love it to be winter all of the time because of that double coat. So how long for growing season, I guess, for grasses and stuff, how long are they able to eat the grass versus being fed hay?
So our winter is longer than most places. So we are usually feeding hay around the end of September to middle of May, beginning of May. it's hard because I do have a limited amount of space. They do have to once we hit springtime, there's not really any pastures that I can completely leave them out of to let the grass grow. And so it's kind of like a slow taper off of hay because they're on the grass that's trying to grow as it's growing. So it's kind of a balance of trying to give them access to fresh grass because that's what they want to be eating, even though we don't really want them to be eating it as it's growing.
Right, for sure. You had mentioned, obviously, Alaskan agriculture is a whole new beast that I could not even imagine to begin to deal with. But talking about hay and feed and all of these things, where are you getting the hay to feed the muskox?
So we've been pretty fortunate in our history that there is a hay field that had been being hayed right next to us, that we generally would get all of our hay right over there. The farmer would pick up the hay bales with the baler truck and drive right over. Hay is obviously kind of a beast, in the world, but also in making Alaska weather. We've had a really good streak of that. Our lovely hay farmer is retiring, and I believe that land is being sold and it's not under a farmland protection. So honestly, we're hoping that we will continue to get local hay, but we're kind of looking like we might have to start getting outside hay. And grain, we have a wonderful grain mill in Anchorage, Alaska Mill and Feed. They supply all kinds of grain to all of the, the Alaska Zoo and the Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center and all of the specialty grain for these animals that are outside of the realm of normal horses, pigs, and goats. So I actually have a Muskox ration that I get from Alaska Mill and Feed. The formula was made by the Large Animal Research Station in Fairbanks. So that is a research station in Fairbanks that has a herd of research animals. I believe right now they have muskox and caribou. And so we work closely together to try to keep everybody as healthy as possible. We're actually looking at redoing kind of their formulation right now. But basically, we act as if the forage for our animals is either grass in the summer or hay in the winter. And then the grain is just a vitamin mineral supplement, essentially. So we're expecting that our muskox are eating their forage as the bulk of their diet. And then our grain is just a vitamin mineral supplement to kind of fill in the gaps where our forage differs from where they would naturally be foraging.
I'm curious, as the herd manager, obviously you're weighing them, so you're getting that hands-on with them weekly to see the weight of them. For you to see a muskox, what to you tells you that you have a healthy looking animal versus maybe somebody that needs a little help?
Honestly, they are incredibly stoic animals, and they will not show you that there's something wrong with them until they are keeling over. So that can be kind of difficult. Weight on the scale is always my number one go-to. Their coat kind of changes color when they're either getting sickly or just deficient in the vitamins and minerals that they need. Copper is an incredibly important source for muskox specifically, and you can always kind of tell that they're getting deficient because they're supposed to be a nice, usually dark color. The Canadian muskox usually are dark all over, and the Greenland muskox have kind of just a white freckled face a little bit more, but generally even between Canadian and Greenland, a nice dark brown color along their sides and down their legs should be what you're hoping for. A nice healthy muskox is going to have a rich dark brown color, and so you can kind of tell when they're not doing as well if their coat lightens in color, or you can almost kind of see it in their hooves that they'll get frail and brittle. But I would say the number one way that I can tell if somebody's not doing well is definitely behavior is a huge thing. They love their mineral pellet. And so the second anybody doesn't want that, it's like, okay, what's happening with you? But then outside of behavior, weight is totally the first indication of health for at least my herd.
Okay, I want to talk about baby muskox. First of all, what do they call them?
They're calves.
They're calves, okay. So what is the gestational period for a muskox?
It is 244 days. Depending on who you talk to, there is a man that swears that it is specifically 244 days on the dot. So that puts you at around 8 months. So we breed intentionally here, as you should on a big farm. And so we put our muskox into harems. So that's one bull with several ladies around the beginning of August, and then they come out the beginning of October. And so that gives you 2 good months of interaction with the bulls. And then we separate them for the rest of the year. And so then the moms all live together so that I can watch them really closely. And then we just hope and pray for babies. In April, May, there are ways to tell if a muskox is pregnant, most of which are really either too expensive or too invasive to be good, consistent options. So really our way of testing if they are pregnant is you have a calf on the ground. And that now we know that you were pregnant.
It worked. So about 8 months, the 244 days. Are muskox typically having a single calf, or are you getting twins or multiples?
Twins are very, very rare. It has happened, but it almost never happens. I don't believe that we've either only had one set of twins or have never, and it's usually not a great situation for either of the calves. Usually you'd have to bottle raise them because they just don't make enough milk for 2 babies.
Typically, how big are the babies?
So we like to say 12 to 15 pounds, but then again, because we kind of err on the side of gentle and cautious, we usually are not getting weights on them until they're at least 3 days old, sometimes even just a week old. And so we've seen babies as big as 27 pounds at birth, but we like to say that 12 to 15 is the average.
Well, and giving them that time, like you said, to bond and not stress out the mother and all of those things, probably a really good thing when you are gently walking up to them and saying, please come to the scale for me. Thank you.
Basically, the worst thing that could happen, the worst thing that could happen is a baby doesn't survive. But the second worst thing that could happen is having a bottle baby. We really, really, really want mom to be able to raise the calf. And so we really try not to mess with them much at all for the first 3 days to a week.
See, you're saying it would be the worst thing to have a bottle baby muskox. And I'm thinking that would be really cute to feed a muskox baby.
Yes, it is really, really cute. I raised 3 muskox calves at the Alaska Zoo that were orphaned from the wild, and they are adorable, and it is delightful. They usually love hanging out with people when they've become accustomed to having bottles and that kind of thing. Problem is then you grow up with a muskox that doesn't respect boundaries, and that can be a huge, huge problem. So we always want mom to be raising their own calf, and then once weaning happens, we can kind of get in there and really socialize, but at no point are we just petting for fun. We are doing everything in the interest of what's best for the calf and its long lifetime success, basically.
So we talked about, obviously, some uses for a muskox would be for fiber and their hair being used. Traditionally, can you share with us what you know about traditionally, what is a muskox used for?
Well, they are certainly, so they're protected to a certain extent by the state of Alaska because they went extinct, but there is a certain number of hunting permits that do happen. And so people do, an incredible trophy. Muskox are pretty cool, but also they are used for subsistence. They have quite a bit of meat on their bones. And so while we don't ever eat any of the muskox that die on this farm, because usually they die old, but that is definitely something that happens up here and is a big part of kind of the culture of muskox. There are so few hunting permits that it is a pretty coveted one. So they can certainly be eaten and people love it, I guess. I've never eaten muskox, but
that was going to be my question. Have you ever eaten a muskox before?
No, I've never tried it. There are people that say that it's the best, and there's people that say it was terrible. So
I'm curious because I myself, I've been raising goats since 2017, and I've raised meat goats. I've never eaten one of my goats, and I've never eaten a goat before, but I know that, it has a certain taste and it needs to be cooked a certain way to taste well. So I'm assuming a muskox is probably similar in the low and slow. We'll have to look up muskox recipes.
Yeah, right? I mean, there are people that say that it is like the best thing ever, and it's like they think that we're crazy that we don't eat them, and the reality is they are not a good option for meat animals because they break everything and they grow so slowly. So they are reaching maturity at not maturity, but full grown body wise, weight wise at 4 or 5. And so that in terms of just growing for meat is not very sustainable, and they're incredibly difficult to deal with. And so it's just not in any way profitable. And so the hair is the way to go for sure.
Yeah. So tell us more about the hair. Like you had said, you brush these animals to get the undercoat from them. How do you brush a muskox?
They come into the barn, into the same space every time. It's a scale on a squeeze chute. And so they become pretty accustomed to standing in there. They get treats in there. We always want it to be a positive experience. Like I said, they all have very individual personalities, and some, like it or tolerate it better than others. And so I definitely have ones that I can't just comb. And so we just have to respect that. We, at the core of the Musk Ox Farm, we are gentle and sustainable. So I would say out of my 75, I probably have 15 that I can't just comb in the squeeze chute. And so the other 65, I can just bring into the place that I weigh them. And you kind of have to protect your arms and be ready for anything. But generally, they come into the stanchion. They have somebody solely there just to feed them treats, their mineral pellet that they are obsessed with, while 1 or 2 people are on either side hand combing the fiber from the guard hair. So we use actually afro picks. So it's metal toothed combs, and just kind of get it out from the guard hair. And that's how you do it.
So with them, you're obviously weighing them every week and bringing them in. Are you brushing them every week for the ones that let you?
No. So they just shed 1 time a year. So they grow their hair all winter. It's what keeps them so incredibly warm and happy in the terrible cold winter. And then usually around the beginning or the middle of April, everybody starts to shed. And really trying to brush them outside of that season is it's just going to be pulling on their hair and they're not going to like it. And B, it takes forever. So like I said before, there is a certain number of kibute products that come from hunters that comb the kibute out of a hunted cape. That takes so much time, and it is very difficult to get all of that hair because it's not meant to be leaving yet. So it's kind of like a switch turns and all of a sudden the hair is coming off, and I just have to time it right that I have them in the barn when they're shedding and get it off of them before it hits the ground.
So what are you doing? I want to say this right. Is it kibute that you're getting off of them, their hair? It's called kibute?
Yes. So we like to say you give a hoot about kibute is the way that we explain it to the hundreds of children that come for their school groups.
And they'll never forget that.
Kiviute.
Kiviute.
Yes.
So typically, like you said, that there's a lot of, I guess, crafters or people for fiber art to use it. I noticed on the website you do have some of it for, what is it called? A ball of kiviute? Like a ball of yarn, but it's kiviute?
Yeah. So basically, we send our raw fiber out to be processed in a huge bunch, usually every 3 years. It goes actually down to Peru, where there is a guy that specializes in special quality fiber. And so basically it gets to him and he does all of the magical things that turns the raw fiber into yarn, dyes some of it, and they do like machine knitting there. And so there are certain garments that we get just like fully produced garments back from him. And then some of it, we have local artists up here that take the raw, undyed yarn and they do magical dyeing and knitting and all of the wonderful things. So we have basically a section of things that are knitted by the guy that processes the fiber, and then specialty items that are, we get the yarn from Peru and then it gets turned into wonderful items by local artists up here.
And I'm assuming, well, maybe I shouldn't assume this, is it similar to wool then, like the feeling of it, or what are the differences that you can tell between it?
The biggest difference is that kiviute is very, very fine and very soft. So it can be considered similar to wool, but it's more of a lace weight, if that makes sense. So it's a very fine fiber. So they used to like to go around and say that kiviute was 8 times warmer and softer and everything than wool. And so that was kind of the selling point. One of the research projects that we've been a part of has actually debunked that a little bit. So that is no longer true. It's not 8 times. But basically the deal is that it is as warm, if not warmer than wool, but it is very fine and very, very soft. And so it's, it's not going to be good for things like big sweaters and the things that you would think for wool, but more just like very fine, soft garment that is incredibly warm also.
Do you have any clothing items or pieces made out of kiviute that you have?
I don't actually. That makes me terrible that I'm the Musk Ox farmer that doesn't have any
No,
kiviute,
it doesn't.
that I don't actually own. Yeah. But my brother bought a hat when I first started, and it is his favorite thing in the whole world. He is like a trapper and does all kinds of wild things in the middle of nowhere, Alaska, and he is always wearing his kiviute hat. So definitely I see the utility.
Yeah.
As well as how pretty the things that can be made out of it.
Yeah, very cool. Research project wise, what kind of research is being done at your farm that you can share with us?
So it's actually kind of a crazy project. We are actually working with the Space Force and Air Force. The Air Force Research Lab is essentially doing a project researching kiviute as a gear option, not necessarily to make garments for the military out of kiviute, but potentially to make synthetic kiviute because it is so fine. And so we have sent kiviute samples, we've sent guard hair samples, we've sent skin biopsy punches so that they can look at not only the fiber itself, but the follicles. And yeah, they're doing all kinds of really incredible work right now with a lot of the samples that I take and send to them.
Yeah. That's so neat. And I'm excited to see what they come up with.
Yeah, it's very exciting. Like I said, very little research is done on muskox and very little is known about muskox. And so anything that we are able to learn about them is always really cool. And any way that I can contribute to that is always really exciting. I love that side of this job. We also work with a geneticist at Cornell University that has years and years and years of DNA samples from our muskox that she's doing all kinds of really cool things with. So I love that side of this job for sure.
Yeah, very cool. I want to ask you, just a simple question. What do you think is your favorite thing about Muskox and working with them?
Oh, man.
So many things.
Yeah, so many things. Honestly, I think probably I love that I am probably the only person that has a title like this. There's very few places that have muskox, let alone this many of them. It's for sure the largest captive herd. And so I really love that I just wake up every day and I come out and I get to see just a huge array of all of the same species. I worked in more than one zoo, and it was always very exciting to do, anything that would benefit the species of whatever animal I was working with. But to have like direct impact on what we've known and what we know about muskox is really exciting to me. So having access to this large of a herd for me is just really cool. Yeah. And to see like I said, the huge array of personality amongst 75 animals is just, it's huge. When I first started, I remember the previous herd manager would be able to just walk out into whatever, up to whatever pasture and be able to almost pick out face by face from very far away who's who. And I thought that was crazy. I was like, there's 75 of the same species, and you're telling me that you can pick individual faces. But now I'm at that place that I could probably see any one of my muskox from, all the way in the back of the pasture, and I could tell you almost certainly which one is which. And I think that's pretty cool.
That's very cool.
I have so many of them, and they're all still so individual.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love that. Alyssa, it has been an absolute pleasure getting to talk to you all about muskox, and, for answering an email to a stranger on the internet saying, hey, will you come talk about muskox with me? Like, you did great.
Thanks. Thank you.
For the listeners who would like to connect with you and the farm, where can they find more information about the Musk Ox Farm?
The muskoxfarm.org. I'm pretty sure it's just the muskoxfarm.org is our home base, and that's everything. We have hundreds and thousands of visitors that come to see us every year, and people always leave knowing a lot more about muskox than they came knowing. And so, yeah, come visit the Musk Ox Farm. It's a great place.
We are also all leaving here knowing much more about muskox than we did when we started. So you did great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. We'll put those links in the show notes so people can find the organization and connect with you and come and see what these big woolly goats look like.
Yeah. Heck yeah.
Thank you again so much for sharing your story with us. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Rural Woman Podcast. The Rural Woman Podcast is more than just a podcast. We are a community. A huge thank you to the Rural Woman Podcast team, audio editor Max Hofer. A special thanks to our Patreon executive producers, Sarah Riedner from Happiness by the Acre and Carrie Munven from Laystone Farms. To learn how you can become a Patreon executive producer or other ways to financially support the show, head on over to wildrosefarmer.com to learn more. Be sure to hit the follow or subscribe button wherever you listen to the podcast to get the latest episodes directly on your playlist. And if you are loving the show, please be sure to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or any other platform that accepts ratings and reviews. You can connect with us on social media at The Rural Woman Podcast and with me at Wild Rose Farmer. One of the best ways you can support the show is by sharing it. Send this episode to a friend or share on your social media. Let's strengthen and amplify the voices of women in agriculture together. Until next time, my friend, keep sharing your story.